In a time where white supremacists feel free to march and rally and fight in the open in Virginia this very weekend, we have to ask ourselves why they can do that. Who are these men, and what do they believe that allows them to embrace ideas that have led directly to the enslavement of an entire people group based solely on the color of their skin, and has led to millions killed across Europe through the Holocaust and the Soviet Union, and has contributed to 2 world wars? Who are they that they've forgotten what their own grandfathers fought for and gave up their lives for on the beaches of Normandy or found behind the gates of Auschwitz? I don't say it lightly, but I think I have to say I think they're all of us. They're what happens to anyone when we forget, within 2 generations, the lessons of our immediate history, much less anything that came before. They're what happens when you don't understand ideas on which our very political and social morality have been founded. Ideas such as inalienable rights, equality, personhood, and human dignity. They're what happens when we don't remember and when we're not able to think. This may seem like an odd way to start to talk about why we read what we read and why. But I think it's how I must start, because I think these are the very things that are at stake. I didn't become a teacher because I wanted you to get good grades and go to college. I didn't do it to make sure that you learned algebra or knew what foreshadowing was in a story. I think you'll do those things and they'll come along and you can go where you want to and get the best grades you can get. But those are totally secondary. Totally secondary. I became a teacher because I think that what we read and why and how we read it shapes our very souls. It's the training ground on which we decide what kind of people we are capable of being and what sort of societies we're able to create and maintain. So what have you been reading this summer? What have you been watching? What have you been listening to? What has been shaping your heart and your mind and your soul during your free time? I'm going to tell you about what's about to. But first, we're going to return to Dorothy Sayers, who we talked about yesterday. In her same lecture, The Lost Tools of Learning, she says, "Has it ever struck you as odd or unfortunate that today, when the proportion of literacy throughout Western Europe is higher than it's ever been?" So, by the way, I looked this up when I was writing this. And the literacy rate across the entire world right now is 74%. And in the United States, it's 86%. This isn't good enough, but it's not where it should be, but it's remarkable, historically speaking. Anyway, she continues, "Has it ever struck you as odd or unfortunate that today, when the proportion of literacy across Western Europe is higher than it has ever been, people should have become susceptible to the influence of advertisement and mass propaganda to an extent hitherto unheard of or unimagined? Do you put this down to the mere mechanical fact that the press and the radio and so on, or in our age, the internet and social media, have made propaganda so much easier to distribute over a wide area? Or do you sometimes have an uneasy suspicion, like I do, that the product of modern educational methods is less good than he or she ought to be at disentangling fact from opinion and the proven from the plausible?" She is giving this lecture immediately following World War II, by the way, where she has witnessed firsthand the incredible destructive force that propaganda can be. "Have you ever," she continues, "in listening to a debate among adult and presumably responsible people, been worried by the extraordinary inability of the average debater to speak to the question, to meet and refute the arguments of the speakers on the other side? And when you think of this, and think that most of our public affairs are settled by debate and committee, have you ever felt a certain sinking of your heart? Is not the great defect of our education today, a defect traceable through all the disquieting symptoms of trouble that I have mentioned, that although we often succeed in teaching our pupils subjects, we fail lamentably on the whole in teaching them how to think. They learn everything except the art of learning. Before I go on with an examination of this quotation, I want to tell you that when I was looking up the literacy statistics and found that 86% number of people who can read in the United States, I found another number right beside it. Approximately 86% of Americans can read and write to the extent that they need to read instructions, signs, writing for basic entertainment like a quick novel or instructions on something, which is what the Institute for Education Science, who did the study, calls literate. But only 15% are what the same study calls fully literate, which is reading at an undergraduate level. In other words, along the way, we lose over 70% of Americans between when they learn how to read on a basic level and when they learn how to read really well. By the way, the percentage of Americans who graduate college is 31%. So I'm going to let you draw your own conclusions about what that means, that only 15% of people can read at a college level, but 31% are graduating from college. Something's wrong. With these statistics in mind, is it any wonder that we too see what Sayers noticed in the 40s? That though more people are able to read, very few are capable of discerning truth in what they read, and distinguishing fact from falsehood, and the art of persuasion with the rigor of good truth-telling. This was a huge issue in the last presidential election, right? The internet is full of absolutely fake news, which is not what the president has taken to calling fake news lately, but actual sites founded solely with the intent to push an agenda with totally false information. They don't even try to copy the truth. And people were and are believing it and reading it and sharing it all the time. So what's gone wrong? How are we learning everything except the art of learning? I suggest that the problem lies in what we read, or rather what we don't read. Here at the Saint Constantine School, you will be asked to read a lot. You know this. You'll read poetry and literature and history and philosophy and theology, all without ever leaving the great book syllabus. Starting in 9th grade, you'll begin to read chronologically through a carefully selected and fought over, trust me, fought over, list of the absolute essentials of Western civilization. I know of no other school, even among all the classical coalitions that we're a part of, that requires you to read as much as we require of you. By a lot. Like, usually the schools are, even really good, rigorous schools are around half. And we argue all the time as a faculty about how difficult it is to keep the list as small as it is. You are about to put a ton of work into what other people would call your English class. You will put more work, more hours than any of your friends, unless they happen to go here. Your reading will not only be longer and more, but it will be significantly harder than your peers. And you will be held to a higher standard in it of writing and class participation than just about anybody you know. So I figured I should tell you why we're doing this to you. There's a modern trend in education to fit curriculum and classes to the abilities and interests of the student. Rather than the school setting a standard that all students have to reach and have reached and will reach, modern educational theorists have encouraged educators to tailor our curriculum to wherever you are at. This sounds good, and probably sounds really good to you, but what it ends up meaning is that rather than doing the very thing that we are supposed to do, and educating you to a standard of competency and literacy that has been held for generations, we are attempting to determine for you what you're capable of, and then ask no more of you than what our assumptions about you tell us. I'm going to repeat that. This means that teachers who are trying to tailor a syllabus for you are making assumptions about you, about what you're capable of, and then trying to educate you no more than they think you're capable of, which means there's a lot riding on their assumption of you. I want to tell you a firsthand account of where this leads. When I first started the academy at HBU, I was asked to travel with the Houston Independent School District to Greensboro, North Carolina. The new superintendent of HISD wanted to show representatives from colleges and universities, such as myself, the work he had done in his previous school district in Greensboro, with the hopes of replicating it in Houston. He had brought a school district that had 25% dropout rate, which is what Houston had at the time as well, up to 2.5%. He was very proud of it. On the plane to North Carolina, I was sitting next to a vice chancellor of Houston Community College. So he's somebody who's above a president. Each Houston Community College has a president, but above that are the vice chancellors and the chancellors, and they run the whole thing. We started talking about education, and he expressed his belief that it was cruel to require lower income students from poor high schools to achieve the same standards as other students. If someone is just going to become a mechanic, he said to me, then they have no need to learn algebra. And we're just lowering our success and retention rates by requiring it of him. He suggested that instead, students take a test, perhaps somewhere when they're around 9 or 10, and if they score a certain way, or if they live in a certain part of town, then high school standards should be different for them. They will not be expected to attend college, and so they shouldn't be expected to do the academic work that would qualify them to. Do you see the problem yet? I was flabbergasted by this theory and this man. He didn't seem to realize that what he was suggesting was a kind of classism that public education was exactly designed to combat. The very institution of which he was a part was supposed to provide an education for the very student he was totally dismissing. It also showed that he had no concept that a child at the age of 10 might not have reached their full academic potential, and that hard work and inspiration and opportunity could come long after elementary school. We accept anybody who's willing to do the work into the Saint Constantine school. I don't care what your grades were before. I don't care what kind of high school you came from, because I think every single one of you can do it and is capable of it, even if you can't really read. And some people come to us, especially in the lower school, like last year, our 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, we had to scrap our English curriculum, just totally scrap it and start from the beginning, because whatever was happening before in their various schools wasn't good enough, and we had to kind of take them back to the basics. And that's okay, we'll do that, because I think anybody can start from the beginning and go quick and catch up. He didn't seem to realize that the test that was meant to help a student be successful doomed them to never reaching higher than a system said that they could. If enacted, this would be a kind of injustice that would harm all of us. It's not education. And it happens to a lesser extent all of the time. Even at private schools or good schools, the quest for student success becomes an end in and of itself, without asking if the success they're achieving is worth achieving at all. There are many, I am told this all the time, who would tell me that I shouldn't give you as much to read as we do, or these particular texts. They're too hard, you've not been prepared for them, or because other schools don't, or because it's much harder work than other students your age are doing, and it's not fair. This is nonsense. I'd call it something stronger, but I'm being recorded. The very point of school is to stretch you, to train you, and as we talked about last night, to set you free. We cannot do this without giving you the real stuff, the readings and the ideas that have shaped our culture and can shape us into who we need to be. To give you anything less would be a sign of disrespect to you. It would be me making assumptions about what you are capable of and trying to find a textbook that fit those assumptions. We assign you these books and we require this much of you because we think it is the most loving and respectful thing that we can do. If we know something's good, why wouldn't we pass it on? So why these particular books? All of you are, or should be, or should have been, reading either the Iliad, Eusebius' History of the Church, Don Quixote, or War and Peace. If you haven't started War and Peace yet, you're in trouble. On Monday, you'll be discussing one of these, except for Eusebius, because you guys will actually start by discussing Luke. These are hard books, and these are great books in the biggest sense of the word. They have maintained their place in our minds and culture because of what they have to offer. We choose all of our books, not because they're old or because they're particularly hard. There are lots and lots and lots of old books, and there are many that are much harder. We chose them because of what they have to say and how they've influenced our culture, our history, and our churches. We read the Iliad and the Odyssey so that we might understand what the Greeks understood about manhood and heroism, greatness, and war. We read War and Peace to experience and explore many of those same concepts 2,000 years later. We read Sense and Sensibility so that we can think well about relationship and passion, poetry, and self-sacrifice. We read everything from Sophocles to John Calvin so that we might think well about fate and free will. We read Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau so that we know how political systems have been built and why. And we talk about how their ideas are applied by authors like Dickens or in the American Constitution. Right in the middle of your high school experience, you will glory in the language, wit, and gravity of Shakespeare, and in the theological splendor of the great ideas brought forward by Anselm and Thomas Aquinas, St. John of Chrysostom, and Gregory of Nazianzus. We will look to our spiritual fathers for guidance and dive into some of the hardest, deepest mysteries of God. We read Don Quixote and P.G. Wodehouse and wonder at what makes a thing funny and what humor is good for. We do all of this while barely skimming the surface of the depths of what human history has created and can offer us. Really, we hope to introduce you to a breadth of literature that will make you keep going. You need to go to colleges that read this stuff. You need to read this stuff on your own. There's so much more. Ask any teacher about what their favorite text is that we cut, and they will instantly have an answer for you. You have been trained at some point or another, and it's very, very hard not to be. It's not your fault. To pass tests and to do only the work required of you to pass them, and then forget whatever it is you put in your head to do it. That ideology and skill set will not serve you here. It will be a detriment to your education. There will be written work and oral exams that will be an academic assessment of your abilities. But they are at the service of the real work. The true work is happening and must happen in your own heart and soul and mind. That's why we read what we read. It's why we must read what we read, and then we must be shaped by it. We must do the hard work that the great books force upon us, because this is the work that has built the societies that we have inherited, the freedom that we have, and the families that we cherish. The weight of all of this glory and goodness and challenge rests squarely on your shoulders. I can't do this work for you. I've done it for myself. I continue to do it. I read these books every year. We all do. We all read whatever we assign you, which is really hard, especially for Mr. Gilbert, because he has 3 classes like that. You could try your best to skim the work in front of you. You can. Everyone does it at some point. You could cheat and lie and probably get away with reading fairly little. I know some of you did that last year, and I know who you are. The punishment of that decision will lie mostly within your own mind and your own soul. We might catch you out in your writing or your exams. Your grades might suffer. We may even expel you if you don't do the work because we take it really seriously. But none of that matters much in the end, compared to the incredible poverty in which you have placed yourself willingly. When given the opportunity, when asked and required to live and dwell in the best that mankind has to offer you, you chose to do something, anything else. And no F in the world will communicate what a personal failure that would be. Sayers has a warning for us. Should we forget why we study the way we do? The truth is that for the last 300 years or so, we have been living upon our educational capital, she says. The post-Renaissance world, bewildered and excited by the profusion of new subjects offered to it, broke away from the old discipline of the schools, which had indeed become sadly dull and stereotyped in its application. But the scholastic tradition, though broken and maimed, still lingered in the public schools and the universities. Milton, however much he protested against it, was formed by it, and the debate of the fallen angels and the disputation of Abigail and Satan has the tool marks of Thomas Aquinas on them. Right down to the 19th century, our public affairs were mostly managed, and our books and journals were for the most part written by people brought up in homes and trained in places where the traditions of great education was still alive in the memory and almost in their blood. Just so, many people today who are atheist or agnostic in their religion are still governed in their conduct by a code of Christian ethics which is so rooted in them, it never occurs to them to question it. But one cannot live on past capital forever. However firmly a tradition is rooted, if it is never watered and nourished, though it dies hard, in the end, it will die. This brings me back to where we started. It may seem extreme, or at least incongruous, that a talk on a reading curriculum would begin and end with a march of neo-Nazis and white supremacists. But again, here I think we see what happens when we let school become a series of subjects towards an arbitrary competency. These are the men that have thoroughly left behind the great Christian traditions of equality and natural right. They are too stupid to remember even 80 years ago, when so many died due to what they are now feeling free to believe. They have surrounded themselves with evil and falsehood, and the world will suffer because of it. There is but one way to combat evil, and that's with the true and the good. In order to combat lies, you must be grounded in the truth so that those lies don't have an effect on you, so that they are transparent and false in the light of what you know and the good work that you've done. We read what we read because it is what shapes us to be who we must be. The center of our school is about your life. You growing up to be who you're supposed to be. And it is this study that we do together that will shape us, for better or for worse, and equip us for this world and the next. So get reading, get thinking, ask questions, and become who you need to be.